This program, part 1 of 2 on the Exodus story and modern archaeology, is copyright 2021 by Pastor Richard A. Mathisen. Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to this presentation, The Exodus Story and Modern Archaeology, What Really Happened. And, I'm going the wrong way. Okay. And it has a subtitle, The Mysterious Origin of Ancient Israel Between 1208 BC and 1000 BC. My name is Pastor Richard Mathisen. I'm a retired Lutheran pastor of the ELCA. And about a year and a half ago, my fiancée, Barbara, and I joined this congregation, and we were married here 1 year ago. So let me introduce my fiancée, Barbara. My wife, Barbara Mathisen, my wife in helping.
And helping, don't forget helping.
Okay. No, she's done a fair amount of work getting all the slides together. So, now why is that? Okay. This is a special presentation to this group. And in the history of Western civilization, one of the most important events was the Exodus story. The Exodus story had a huge impact on the history of Western civilization. And by Exodus story, I mean the one starting with Moses at the burning bush, the Exodus, Mount Sinai, the conquest of Canaan, all the way up to the establishment of the kingdom of ancient Israel. That's what I mean by Exodus story. In the history of Western civilization, the Exodus story is very important. It's very well known. But the actual archaeological events are still mysterious and controversial. And one of our questions is, how does the Exodus story relate to the archaeological events? This is my introduction now. Part 1 of the introduction is to talk about 2 game-changing archaeological discoveries. And here's a map of the entire Middle East, and you see on the bottom the Egyptian Empire, which included Canaan, and up, now where did I put my, I have a pointer here, and up there is the Hittite Empire, the Assyrian Empire, and over here the Babylonian Empire. So these were 4 huge and powerful empires. And during the last 50 years, and especially during the 1970s, there were some dramatic archaeological discoveries that changed the way archaeology looked at the Exodus. There was also a flood of new information for that entire area, and a very recent dramatic discovery in the past 5 years. So the first game-changing discovery, very recent, is about the pertinent time period for the origin of ancient Israel, namely 1208 BC to 1000 BC. So that is our pertinent time period for the origin of ancient Israel. 1208 is the first mention of a group of people called Israel outside the Bible, and 1000 is the date that ancient Israel was established as a nation state. So that is our pertinent timeline. Now it also happens to be the pertinent timeline for the Exodus story. And now, there is much that is controversial in this time period. And it's controversial because there are 2 diametrically opposing viewpoints. And within the science of biblical archaeology, they have a name: the Maximalists and the Minimalists. The Maximalists believe everything in the Bible must be taken as true. It's about the credibility of the Bible. The Minimalists believe nothing in the Bible can be taken as true. And so the Maximalists are usually called the literalists. They take the Bible literally. The Minimalists are called the postmodernists because they don't even think there is such a thing as truth. Now, I'm going to suggest that we should take both points of view and be respectful to them. We should be respectful to the Maximalists because they, in their mind, this is a religious viewpoint, they're trying to protect the authority of Scripture by insisting that everything it says is correct. And we should respect the religious viewpoint whether we agree with it or not. The skeptics, the minimalists, the ultra-skeptics, are also deserving of some respect because we all know we live in a highly skeptical age where we are always hearing advertising claims for products and services, and we know enough to be skeptical. We're always hearing political opinions from two very different points of view. We know enough to be skeptical. And the skeptics are the ones, the extreme skeptics just take that to the ultimate. Okay, and there had been a controversy for the last 30 years about this date of 1000 BC and whether there really was a nation state of ancient Israel on that date. And what that means, it's about David, Solomon, and the unified monarchy. This is the extreme skeptics and allies, but they were denying that between 1987 and about 2017, and it was recently settled by new archaeology from a site called Kirbet Kiafa. And I got that site, that's what it looks like. But I'll talk more about that later. Anyway, now this is an established time period. We know there was a pertinent time period for the origin of ancient Israel for this 208-year period. And there have been two game-changing discoveries. One is the pertinent time period, and the other is the discoveries of the 1970s that changed everything. And what I'm going to do now is there's the time period. And what happened in the 1970s was archaeologists discovered a group of people living in ancient Canaan about 1100 BC, which is about halfway through. In fact, I'll put that up there. If you can see that little notch at 1100. Group of people living in Canaan who were the Proto-Israelites. They were the ancestors of the Israelites of 100 years later. The Proto-Israelites, the ancestors of the group that's going to found the state of Israel, the nation state of 100 years later. This is the great-great-grandparents of the founders of ancient Israel that were discovered living in Canaan. And I'm going to refer to them as the mysterious hill country people. We call them hill country people because that's where they live, and you'll see that in a second. But they're mysterious because even archaeology today doesn't know who they were or who they came from. Now, most of you probably think we know that these are the slaves that Moses led out of Egypt to the Promised Land. But in archaeology, that is not accepted as necessarily true. That has to be established. And so these are a mysterious group, but we know that they are the group 100 years later that is going to found the nation state of ancient Israel. Now here's a map of ancient Israel, and I think you all know this. You always orient yourself to the Sea of Galilee in the north and the Dead Sea in the south. But a map like this gives a very confusing message about the topography because it makes it look like Israel is flat, and Israel is very definitely not flat. In fact, here This is a drawing done by a rabbi in Israel for the purpose of teaching about the Holy Land. But as you can see, the River Jordan, you can see Galilee up in the top left-hand corner there. If I can get it, there. And then the Dead Sea. You can see the Jordan River has cut a deep trench in the mountains. And on the far side, which is Jordan, the mountains are very high. And even on the near side, you can see the mounds, the brown areas. Now, of course, the Canaanites of 1208 live in the green areas. Almost all the population in 1208 lives in the lowlands, because that's where all the good farming land is. But by 1100, we're going to see that there's a substantial population in the hill country, which are these Proto-Israelites, the ancestors of the Israelites. And they are in two areas, actually. One, if I can find, where is that? There it is, okay. One is the central hill country, which is, there's Jerusalem between these two. The central hill country is north of Jerusalem, and the Judean hill country is south of Jerusalem. And that's the place that archaeologists found these mysterious hill country people living, who they knew immediately were the ones that 100 years later were going to found the nation state of ancient Israel. So the 1970s discovery of the hill country people was huge. Until then, archaeological attention was focused on the cities in the lowlands. I can go back to that. And in the lowlands, the Canaanites were ruled by the Egyptians. You saw already that's part of the Egyptian empire, and it's a brutal occupation by the Egyptians. So all the archaeological attention was focused on the green area. And then suddenly in the 1970s, they found these people living in the hill country who were going to be the founders of ancient Israel. And they were surprised. So here we go. I'm a member, I love archaeology. I'm not an archaeologist, obviously. But I'm a member of the Biblical Archaeology Society, and they have an annual 3-day conference where people who are interested can go, and I've been to 4 of them now, Boston, Denver, San Diego, and the last one a month ago was on Zoom. My goal today is to provide you with the latest and most up-to-date information about modern biblical archaeology, the science. So, in this introduction, I just finished talking about the 2 game-changing discoveries, the pertinent time period, and the discovery of the people, the hill country people. And now I'm going to shift to the historical context, part 2 of the introduction. I call it non-archaeological because archaeology tends to ignore the larger context. And I'm going to suggest to you the larger context is extremely important. And so, historical context. Don't miss the forest for the trees. What does that mean? You can probably tell me. I mean, don't get so wrapped up in the nitty-gritty details you lose sight of the big picture. And to me, the huge impact of the Exodus story on the history of Western civilization is the forest, the big impact. That's what's really important, much more important than the nitty-gritty details, which is what archaeology tends to focus entirely on. Okay, in 1208 BC, the start of the pertinent time period, the Middle East was dominated by 4 huge empires: Egyptian, Hittite, Assyrian, and Babylonian. And here they are. Egyptian to the south, which includes all of Canaan and Phoenicia, the Hittite Empire to the north, the Assyrian Empire, and the Babylonian Empire. Those were the empires of 1208. And these four empires were all huge, powerful, very religious, and polytheistic. Okay? I can go through them one by one. Egyptians, huge, powerful, very religious and polytheistic. Hittite Empire, the same. Assyrian, the same. Babylonian, the same. But by 1000 BC, the end of the pertinent time period, a new nation state exists called Ancient Israel, which is on its way to monotheism. Now, we don't know exactly, well, there's debate about whether it's monotheistic at that point or later. But here is the map of ancient Israel. And we have to ask, where did monotheism come from? And the answer is it came from Moses, from the Exodus story. Moses at the burning bush. And when Moses is at the burning bush, he hears a voice tell him, Moses, take off your shoes. You are standing on holy ground. And is that voice of a higher power, is that voice polytheistic? How many think it's polytheistic? Nobody. It's monotheistic, right? In fact, it's not merely monotheistic, it's intolerantly monotheistic. No other gods, right? No other gods. So that higher power is intolerantly monotheistic, rigorously moralistic. It's going to lay down 10 commandments, right? And people will be told, follow these or else I will punish you, including the most important one, no other gods, and a plan for freedom. Jump ahead to the 1st century AD. I'm going to be galloping through history here. The time of Jesus of Nazareth and Paul of Tarsus. In 1st century AD, you have both Judaism and Christianity, but both have this intolerant monotheism, rigorous morality, and what scholars of literature call the mother of all freedom stories. The Exodus story is a story of freedom. And it is, in fact, the paradigm used by almost everybody writing freedom stories. Now, those Christians in the 1st century were facing the Roman Empire, which was huge, powerful, very religious, and polytheistic, right? We know it was very religious because they persecuted Christians for not being religious enough, right? Not worshiping the right gods, especially the emperor. Here's the Roman Empire, which was huge. But then, galloping forward in 313 AD, Roman Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity. 391, Roman Emperor Theodosius I made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. And then for the next 1,000 years, the history of Western civilization was profoundly influenced for over 1,000 years by Christianity with its intolerant monotheism, rigorous morality, and the mother of all freedom stories. So for over 1,000 years, this is the Dark Ages and the High Middle Ages, which included the start of the universities, and I have a slide on the 10 earliest universities in the world, all founded by Christians in the High Middle Ages. And we go through the Dark Ages, the High Middle Ages, the Later Middle Ages, Renaissance, Reformation, up to the Enlightenment, and it's all deeply influenced by this religion of intolerant monotheism, rigorous morality, and the mother of all freedom stories. And by that...
Can you define for people the concept of mother of all freedom?
Yeah, the mother, okay. The story of, the Exodus story is a story of freedom, right? The Israelites are being led by Moses out of Egypt to freedom, out of slavery to freedom in the promised land, where they set up a new nation state. And that is a story of freedom, and the scholars who study literature refer to this story as the mother of all freedom stories, certainly of Western civilization. And you can trace it, you know, even in our own time. You know, the civil rights movement took as their paradigm this particular story of Moses. So, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. But where did this intolerant monotheism come from? And the answer is from the Exodus story. So, because we know that when Moses was there, and that Exodus story was the official history of ancient Israel, right? We call it a religion, but it was their official history. But it was a history of the pertinent time period, right? The events of the pertinent time period. But it was also, and this is critical, it was a theological interpretation of the critical time period. A monotheistic theological interpretation. So we may think of it, well, it's history. Well, it's history and theology all run together into one big package. It is a theological interpretation, and in fact, I refer to it as a revolutionary theological interpretation. This is the start of monotheism in the world, which is now basically the dominant religion of everybody in the world. So the historical context, don't miss the forest for the trees, and the huge impact of the Exodus story on the history of Western civilization is more important, I would suggest, than the details are. But we're going to be spending all our time today on the details, the nitty-gritty. I just want to get the historical context clear. That's the end of my introduction, and now we start the main presentation. Barbara at this point starts rolling her eyes. Well, she says you're going to roll your eyes. But the original design of this presentation was 10 sections, 9 sections completely on archaeology, and basically a little bit boring. And then section 10, I compare the Bible story to the archaeology and have number 10 is a summary and six conclusions. And at that point, my wife intervened. Yes.
To tell us the truth?
I'll tell you the truth. My wife intervened, and what she said was, Richard, you got the tone of voice?
Oh, yes, yes.
Richard, she said, Richard, you hear that from your spouse or your significant other? Okay, I got a lot of agreement there. Richard, by the time you get to section 10 and your 6 brilliant conclusions, well, that's what she said. By the time you get to section 10 and your 6 brilliant conclusions, your audience will be asleep. Why don't you just move all 6 conclusions up to the beginning? And I did that. Here is what she said. Why don't you move it to the beginning? And I did it. So now we're going to be off to the races. Okay? I'm going to go right to the end of the story, give you the 6 conclusions, and we'll start. Conclusion number 1. The pertinent time period was a time of anarchy and chaos. And that was throughout the entire Middle East. You saw this before. We had the map of the 4 empires, the 4 superpowers of 1208. They're all going to collapse. All 4 of them collapsed in this soon after 1208. Starting in 1208, the Hittite Empire in the north collapsed. Okay? By between 1208 and 1580, the Hittite Empire gets wiped out. The capital is totally in ruins. In the same time period, the Babylonian, in fact, I'll go back to that. In the same time period, the Babylonian Empire collapsed, the Assyrian Empire collapsed, and the Egyptian Empire starts to collapse. The Egyptian empire is going to take about 75 years to collapse, but at the end of that, there's no more Egyptian empire. 4 huge empires, and the collapse plunged the entire Middle East into anarchy and chaos. It's like before 1208, you see the green law and order, it was oppressive law and order, the 4 empires. Then you have the period 1208 to 1000 BC of anarchy and chaos. And then after 1000 BC in the land of Canaan, you have law and order because the state of ancient Israel has been established. And so you have almost the old normal, the pertinent time period with anarchy and chaos, and the new normal. And when law and order was restored, there was a new nation state called ancient Israel. Now, some 8 older empires were also reestablished. The old Assyrian that had collapsed was reestablished as the Neo-Assyrian Empire and would eventually conquer the northern kingdom. And the old Babylonian would eventually be reconstituted, and it would go on to conquer the southern kingdom of Judah and cause the Babylonian exile. But there was this 208-year period of anarchy and chaos. What caused the collapse? Historians still do not agree. Everybody agrees it happened, but the cause is still up for a lot of discussion. And if you're interested in that, there's a 2014 book by archaeologist Eric Klein. He's a National Geographic scholar. And the title is 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed. And he's talking about all the different theories and the different ways of looking at it. So what happened in 1177? You've heard of the Philistines? You've heard of the Philistines, okay. Well, that was the year the Philistines and some other sea peoples, and you can think about them as pirate ships, tried to conquer Israel. They invaded the Nile Delta trying to conquer Israel. They failed, but they then settled in 5 cities in Canaan, which are very well known to us, and we'll get to them. So, summary. Conclusion number 1, the pertinent time period was a time of anarchy and chaos. And everybody in archaeology agrees with that. 2, the collapse of cuneiform in Canaan. Cuneiform was the earliest written language in the history of civilization, written on clay tablets. It had about 600 different symbols. And here's a slide I've done for other Bible courses. It shows civilization from 3000 BC to 2000 AD, 5,000 years. And from 3000 BC until 1200, the language of civilization was always cuneiform. On the left, that's what cuneiform looks like. And you can see a clay tablet on the right. And that's a library of cuneiform tablets. Scholars today have more than 170,000 of these clay tablets, cuneiform tablets from all over the Middle East. And that was the way the empires of 1208, Egyptian, Hittite, Assyrian, and Babylonian, communicated with each other by cuneiform. But when the empires collapsed, cuneiform collapsed in Canaan. That's our summary. Conclusion number 2. Collapse of cuneiform in Canaan. Now we're going to move fast because, conclusion 3, that led to the Phoenicians inventing the Phoenician alphabet. And the Phoenicians were to the north. The collapse of the Egyptian empire allowed the Phoenicians to flourish as traders because they had been under the thumb, the iron fist of the Egyptian empire. They invented a much simplified method of written language. And they lived up to the north of Canaan, the main cities Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, and Byblos. And there they are. You can see way at the top, It's Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, and Byblos. And on the left is Cuneiform writing, which is complicated, about 600 symbols, Phoenician alphabet, 22 consonants, no vowels, and it was standardized by about 1050 during this pertinent time period. So if we go to our pertinent time period, put another notch there for 1050, which is when the Phoenician alphabet is standardized up north of Israel. So, and the Phoenician alphabet had derivatives, languages that took it as a basis. So 1050 was the Phoenician alphabet standardized, 22 consonants, no vowels. By 850, the Hebrew alphabet is standardized, 22 consonants, no vowels. And you can think of that as about the time of Amos or the first part of Isaiah. And the Phoenician alphabet is the source of all biblical languages. Phoenician, 22 consonants, no vowels. Hebrew, 22 consonants, no vowel. Aramaic, the language of part of Daniel and part of Ezra, 22 consonants, no vowels. And the Greek language, 22 consonants and 5 vowels. So the Greeks invented the vowels. You all know that Hebrew is 22 consonants and no vowels, right? Okay. So summary, conclusion number 3, Phoenicians invented the Phoenician alphabet. And conclusion 4, the Exodus story was written in the Hebrew language sometime after 850 BC, because that's when it had developed into its final form. And whatever else happened, the Exodus story was written at least 100 years after it happened, because if it happened, the Exodus, we're talking archaeology, if the Exodus event happened before 1100, there were no written records at that time, and the earliest possible time for written records might have been 1000. So you can see that if the Proto-Israelites are in Canaan in 1100, the Exodus had to happen prior to that time. But it couldn't get written down until at least 1000 BC. Summary, conclusion number 4, Exodus story was written in the Hebrew language sometime after 850 BC, at least 100 years after happening. Now we get to the important stuff. Conclusions 5, remember I said 6 conclusions? 5 and 6 are about the pertinent time period. This is what really matters. We're going to split the pertinent time period into 2 halves, right? The left half from 1208 to 1100, and then the right half from 1100 to 1000. And conclusion 5 on the left side is 1208 to 1100, first half of the pertinent time period. Conclusion 6 is going to be about the second half, 1100 to 1000. And here is who's involved. In conclusion 5, we have 4 groups: Egyptians, Philistines, Canaanites, and mysterious hill country people, right? And in conclusion 6, the second half, we only have the Egyptians are gone. The Egyptian empire has collapsed. There's no Egyptians in Canaan anymore. We have Philistines, Canaanites, and the mysterious hill country people. So we're going to take them one at a time. Conclusion 5, 1208 BC to 1100. And remember I said Egyptians, Philistines, Canaanites, and mysterious hill country people, right? The Egyptians collapsed between 1208 and 1133. That's the 75-year period of the Egyptian collapse. So by the end of this time period, by 1100, the Egyptians are gone. The Philistines, remember they attacked in 1177, they attacked the Delta and settled in the 5 cities. They attacked 1177, were defeated, settled in 5 cities, and became Egyptian mercenaries. Okay? The Egyptians said, you have your choice of being killed or working for us as mercenaries. The Philistines became Egyptian mercenaries, and they were from the Aegean Sea area. We'll talk about that more. Now, what's happening to the Canaanites? The people, remember, down in the green area, all the cities of Canaan? They've been under Egyptian rule for more than 300 years, and it's been an iron fist rule of the Egyptians. And from 1208 until 1177, when the Philistines attack, the Canaanites are under Egyptian rule. Then, when the Philistines come in and settle in the 5 cities and become mercenaries of the Egyptians, now between 1177 and 1133, the Canaanites are being governed by the Egyptians using Philistines as mercenary soldiers. And then after 1133, when the Egyptians suddenly pull out of Canaan, I have a question mark. We don't know what happens to the Canaanites at that point. It would seem they're free of Egyptian rule. And the Philistines are still in their 5 cities, and we'll do that in a second. So, now I want to say a little bit more about the Philistines, because they not only became Egyptian mercenaries, and we said they were from the Aegean Sea area. Remember, that's a long way away. They added 25,000 immigrants. 25,000 people from Greece, Crete, Southeast Asia, immigrated into the Philistine cities, the 5 cities of the Philistines. And they came with pigs. The Philistine culture is a pig-eating culture. The Canaanites and the mysterious hill country people are not. Their Philistines come in with their pigs and with their completely different culture. It's a European culture. It's a different language, not a written language. But the Philistines come in, and here you have 25,000 people in 5 cities. They're a colony within Canaan. And those are Canaanite cities they took over. And then we get to the question, here's the 5 cities of the Philistine Pentapolis: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gath, and Ekron. And you know, they're mentioned in the Bible, the 5 cities of the Philistines. Everybody knows that, I hope. Okay, and on this map you can see where that is. There's the Philistines: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gath, and Ekron. And you can see that dotted line. That's the boundaries of the Philistine territory. And we know it's the boundaries because I call it the pig bone line. You can actually find in the archaeological remains, the archaeologists are digging it up, that the percentage of bones within Philistia is far higher than in the rest of Canaan. And when they count bones, what they do is they count sheep, goat, cattle, and pigs. And the question is, what percentage of that is pigs? And in Canaan, it's mostly 1% or so. In the mysterious hill country, it's 0%, which won't surprise you. But in the Philistine area, it's from 5 to 19%. In other words, pigs are a large part of the Philistine diet, and they were really not a major part of anything in Canaan. So not only is there a new 25,000 person community sitting in the Philistine area, but it has a clear boundary, and you can actually trace. You can't see, there's Ekron, but there's a city called Gezer that's about 5 miles away. And the dramatic difference between the two of them just shows that there's a cultural line there. The Philistines against the rest of the Canaanites. And the Philistines took over, those 5 cities were formerly Canaanite cities. I showed you this slide because I wanted to show you where the Philistines came from. See that green area over there? That's Greece, that's Crete, that's Cyprus, and that's Asia Minor. But that's about 800 miles away that the Philistines came from and immigrated. So what about the mysterious hill country people? That's what we're all waiting for, right? These are the Proto-Israelites. Okay, so conclusion 5, it's down at the bottom, number 4. Mysterious hill country people, huge increase in population from an unknown source or sources. Remember, I said they're mysterious. There's a huge increase, nobody doubts this, but where it came from is still very much mysterious. Archaeology does not have an answer. Now, they are living in these 2 areas that oops, I didn't get that slide yet. Oh, they're living in the central hill country north of Jerusalem and the Judean hill country, and there they are. The central hill country north of Jerusalem, there's Jerusalem, and then the Judean hill country. That's where this newly arrived group is living. It's about 25,000 people. They are living in the hill country when before there was almost nobody there. In fact, here we're showing the population. This is conclusion number 5 is the period 1208 to 1100. And we're going to be looking at who was there in 1208 and who was there in 1100. And in 1208, the Egyptians had troops there and some governors and functionaries. But by 1100, 0. The Egyptians are gone. The Philistines in 1208 have nobody. Remember, they came in 1177. But by 1100, there's 25,000. The Canaanites, at the start of the period, had 50,000, and by the end, they have maybe the same number, we're not quite sure. And the mysterious hill country people had about 3,000 in 1208, and now they have 25,000. There's been a huge influx into that hill country from an unknown source or sources. That is the true mystery of the Exodus, according to archaeology. Where did those people in the hill country come from? And the answer is, we don't know. In fact, until now, I've been doing what I would call consensus archaeology. This is everything I've said so far is what archaeologists agree on. Now we come to the point where they disagree, because there's a big disagreement here. Okay. This is showing the actual settlements, and now I'm going to be looking at the central hill country, because remember, that's the part north of Jerusalem. That's where most of the action is. And that's where we have good numbers. In 1208, there were 28 settlements spread out over that whole central hill country, and a total of less than 3,000 people. By 1100, there are 216 settlements and 20,000 people. There have been a huge increase in the hill country from an unknown source or sources. And then you get to the question of theories. Who were these mysterious hill country people? And the 2 theories in archaeology are called the Canaanite urban escapees theory and the Canaanite pastoral nomad theory. The urban escapee says, well, this is a time of anarchy and chaos, right? The Egyptians are in the middle of a collapse, and the Middle East has collapsed, so they can't even get, trade has been really badly affected. The Canaanite cities are struggling. Anyway, the idea of the Canaanite urban escapees is people from the Canaanite towns went up into the hill country and started farming instead of living in the towns. The Canaanite pastoral nomad theory is talking about pastoral nomads, that's Bedouin types living in tents with their sheep and goats, trying to find land, who found land up in the hill country and then eventually settled down. Those are the two theories of archaeology. Now, of course, there's a third possibility, which is obvious to most of us, right? Persons from outside Canaan, such as from the Nile Delta, the ones led by Moses. So it's very hard for me to understand why that almost never gets mentioned in archaeology. There's almost a hostility to it. But what both of those theories, the Canaanite urban escapees theory, admits, well, yeah, there were probably some people from the Nile Delta who got there. And the same thing for the Canaanite pastoral nomad theory. And I think they have to do that because the story of the Exodus gets written as if all the people in the hill country came from Egypt under Moses. But that's where we're at right now. In archaeology, there are those three theories. And so here's our summary. The Egyptians collapsed between 1208 and 1133, so they're gone. Philistines attacked in 1177, defeated, settled in 5 cities, became Egyptian mercenaries. They were from the Aegean Sea area. They added 25,000 immigrants with pigs. And the Canaanites were under 3 different rules: Egyptian rule, Egyptian and Philistine. Egyptians aided by the Philistine mercenaries. And then whatever happened after the Egyptians left, the Canaanites seemed to be on their own, free. And then the mysterious hill country people had a huge increase in population from an unknown source or sources. Now we get to conclusion 6, what happened in the second half of the pertinent time period. And what happened is the Philistines began to expand to the north and the east. See those red arrows? The Philistines start expanding after the Egyptians are out of there. I guess they see an opportunity. But the Philistines start expanding. I'm having trouble with this mouse. There we go. They begin to expand to the north and the east. The second group of people is the Canaanites. What was their reaction? We don't know. And what was the reaction of the mysterious hill country people? Resistance. That is viewed by them as an attack to their very existence, an existential threat. And so, but this is over the course of 100 years. It's not like suddenly it happened. This is what, 4 or 5 generations of people? But that Philistines are trying to move out into the rest of Canaan, and the hill country people are opposing them. And of course, we think the Canaanites were probably not too happy. This is their former mercenaries that had been enforcing Egyptian rule. And what happened is the hill country people moved down into the lowlands and took over control of the lowlands. Whether they took it voluntarily with the Canaanites or by conquering the Canaanites, or it's very hard to figure out what's going on. But by the time you get to 1000 BC, the entire Canaanite population is in cities run by Israelites. So that's where we come out again, and that's the Philistine expansion. And here's a very interesting statistic. This is the mysterious hill country people. In 1208, there were about 3,000 people, just a few, scattered few. By 1100, there's 25,000 people. And by 1000, when the state of Israel is established, 0. Everybody from the hill country comes down into the lowlands to take control and basically to fight the Philistines. In other words, the Philistine threat is what catalyzes the hill country, the Proto-Israelites, to come out of the hill country and move down into the area that's been deserted now by the Egyptians. You know, it's a bunch of Canaanite cities that are on their own, and the Canaanites are facing a dual threat, right? They have the hill country people, but they also have the Philistines. And there's going to be a three-way cultural clash going on in Israel. I said the hill country emptied out, presumably to move to the lowland cities to oppose the Philistines. Summary and 6 conclusions. Oh, yeah.
I'm a little confused, excuse me. Did they move back down toward the ocean then? Or did they go over the hill into low country on the other side of the
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how I can... Did you see the slide with the hill country and the mountains?
I did, yeah.
Okay, yeah. They're moving out of the hill country, the brown area, down into the green area.
Okay.
Where all the cities are.
Oh, okay.
But until that point, the hill country people have been avoiding the cities.
Right.
And why have they been avoiding? Because the cities are run by Egyptians with an iron fist.
Mm-hmm.
They're up in the hill country to get away from the Egyptians. That's why they wound up there.
Right.
And now the Egyptians are gone, and the Philistines are threatening. And they have a whole different culture, a pig culture, and that's what the hill country, the Proto-Israelites, are preparing to oppose, and that's the reason why they set up the State of Israel.
Oh, sorry, me.
No,
All right.
you.
Some of the research that has been done by the archaeologists suggests that there were not one group of Canaanite people, but 2. The so-called 10 tribes of Israel were culturally and ethnically one group of Canaanites, and the other 2, which were traditionally called the 2 tribes of Israel that became Judea, were actually a different cultural, linguistic, and everything else. That Canaan was not one group of people, but actually 2.
I don't know about that. Certainly, archaeology is not very friendly to the 12 tribes. They think that later. But there really was a difference between the Judean hill country and the central hill country.
Yes, yes.
The central hill country is essentially the nucleus that becomes Samaria, you know, or the northern kingdom, and then later Samaria. And the Judean hill country is what becomes Judea. When the nation splits, and it did split for some very definite reasons, which are beyond my purview right now.
Okay.
But so I'm just going to run through the 6 conclusions, okay? I announced 6. Time of anarchy and chaos, the time period. Collapse of Cuneiform in Canaan. Phoenicians invented the alphabet about 1050 BC. Exodus story written in Hebrew after 850 BC. Egyptian collapse, two huge migrations, one from Aegean Sea to Philistia and one from unknown source up into the hill country. And then finally, the 6th period, the hill country moving down to the lowlands to gain control of the whole of Canaan except for the Philistine area. Philistines stay there, but they get hemmed in really where that line, that dotted line was showing. Now, I'll take some questions. Well, I'm already getting them, that's fine.
Well, I was just wondering about, I had learned about a theory that the Israelite people and the Canaanite people were culturally, or at least linguistically, linked.
Yeah,
That, and I think you touched on that early on in your lecture. This idea that instead of an entire people coming out of Egypt and coming into the hill country, that instead these were Canaanites that formed their own culture but came from the greater Canaanite culture. Can you explain why some archaeologists believe that, and your opposing view if you disagree?
no, I think I gave 2 out of those 3 theories, and the 2 that archaeologists hold are the Canaanite urban escapees, so they came out of Canaan to get away from the Egyptians, presumably. Or they were Bedouin pastoral nomads who settled, but from Canaan. Both of them are Canaanites with very different kinds of backgrounds. But what I would say is, no, but this is a good question. And let's suppose there's urban Canaanites that go up into the hill country. Now you could say, well, they're still Canaanites. No, not really, because in the Canaanite areas, they are living in a stratified culture, palaces, rich people living in palaces, poor people living in hovels. They've got top-down leadership, starting with the Egyptians, who are basically enforcing a very brutal regime on them. That's one world. The moment they come into the hill country, they're in a different world. The hill country has no cities. The hill country is a bunch of farmhouses. It's like each of those 218 settlements is like about an acre, the size of a football field. Maybe it's got 30 or 40 farmhouses. They're in an entirely egalitarian atmosphere, and that culture reflects it. So it's not merely like, well, we keep our Canaanite culture and go into the hills. We now adopt or have to adapt over the course of 200 years to a whole different culture. Does that?
Yeah.
Okay, what happened, we're going to be talking about exactly what happened to the Egyptians and the Philistines.
Yeah.
They were invaded by the Philistines. They beat the Philistines.
Yes.
But it also set off, remember the whole Middle East is in anarchy and chaos. And that's affecting Egypt as well. And we're going to be talking about how they stand up to it for 75 years.
Yeah.
But eventually, it gets to them, and and Egypt is really almost in a state of civil war by the time they pull their troops out.
Yes, that's correct.
All right, let's just take a 5-minute break, and we'll be back here and finish up